Cybersecurity experts say North Korea may be to blame for the unprecedented global ransomware attack. This is new information. The hacking has crippled computer systems in at least 150 countries since Friday. Experts say that the digital fingerprints resemble other attacks mounted by North Korea.
Hospitals paralyzed, surgeries halted, and today we learned of an auto assembly line that suddenly stopped because computers had shut down. Hackers infecting some 300,000 computers in more than 150 countries now, including the US.
A large-scale cyber attack has plunged the UK's health service into chaos. Computers in hospitals and clinics across the country shut down on Friday, forcing patients to be turned away. The National Health Service's IT systems and telephone networks appear to have been targeted, with some hospitals now operating on an emergency-only basis. The ransomware computer attack demands $300 per computer in electronic currency in order to free files from encryption.
Many countries were on alert as the working week began, fearing the spread of the computer virus would speed up as millions powered on their Windows computers on Monday morning. In China, a leading security software company reported nearly 30,000 institutions, including government agencies and universities, had been hit.
Over the past few days, our team has been working closely with other agencies and experts to provide support for our major sectors, help them deal with the problem quickly, and upgrade their computers. We are stepping up monitoring and precaution efforts.
Part of the virus, that which allows it to spread from computer to computer, is believed to have been developed by the US National Security Agency, the NSA. It's thought the code was then later stolen by hackers and leaked sometime later. Last month, Microsoft, the maker of Windows, gave users a security update to prevent computers from becoming infected. Now the company's president has hit out at the NSA and says the attack should be a wake-up call for governments.
The world waking up to more fallout from a global cyber attack on Monday. Governments and businesses in Asia reporting some disruptions from the WannaCry ransomware worm, as experts warn of a wider impact to come as employees power up computers and check emails.
The ransomware attack that hit worldwide on Friday is worse than originally thought. Europol said Sunday the cyber attack affected more than 100,000 organizations in at least 150 countries. But the group warns those numbers could rise when people return to work Monday and power up their computers. The attack locked hospitals in England out of their own systems, blocking them from accessing critical information. One man's open heart surgery had to be canceled. The Central Bank of Russia says it was able to detect the attack and stop it without any information being compromised. Germany's national railway was also affected by the attack, as was FedEx in the US. A researcher in Britain and an engineer in the US stopped the attack from spreading further. While analyzing it, they discovered coding that flipped the ransomware's kill switch. Europol says so far, not many people have paid the ransom to regain access to their computer's systems. The agency pointed victims to a website that helps people and organizations who've been attacked by ransomware. Experts are warning people to patch their computer software and update their computer security before Monday to prevent damage from this or any other attack.
Microsoft is blaming the U.S. government for not doing enough to stop a massive cyber attack over the weekend. The attack was caused by a cyber worm dubbed WannaCry. It's a ransomware that locks up computers and demands money, ransom, to unlock them. Over the weekend, it locked up more than 200,000 computers in more than 150 countries. Among those affected were factories, hospitals, and schools. In a blog post on Sunday, Microsoft President Brad Smith said government intelligence services knew it was coming, but didn't share enough information with vulnerable companies.
Cybersecurity researchers tracking the attack tonight say the trail could lead to North Korea, that the computer code that produced the so-called WannaCry attack with these ominous messages appears to have similarities to the code used by North Korea in an attack on international banks last year. It could be someone else using the North Korean code, researchers say, but the country has a long record of computer criminality.
The North overnight said it successfully tested a missile capable of carrying a heavy nuclear warhead. Analysts in South Korea say it flew higher and longer than any other from the North.
The country's 7th missile test of the year was launched from North Korea's west coast yesterday. The missile landed in the Sea of Japan near the Russian coast.
The KN-17 missile lifted off near the country's west coast, reaching an altitude of more than 1,300 miles. North Korea says the missile was intentionally fired at a high angle out of consideration for its neighbors. It traveled more than 400 miles before splashing down into the Sea of Japan, roughly 60 miles from Russia, according to U.S. intelligence. If launched at a normal trajectory, it could have reached U.S. military bases in Guam. International condemnation was quick. South Korea's newly elected president, Moon Jae-in, said the launch was a reckless provocation, while the White House called for stronger sanctions and noted the missile's proximity to Russia, saying that President Donald Trump cannot imagine that Russia is pleased. The timing could not have been worse for Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's hosting world leaders, including Vladimir Putin, at a global forum in Beijing. This morning, Putin called the test counterproductive and dangerous.
North Korea is capable of continuing to develop longer-range missiles.
Physicist David Wright says the regime's longest test to date shows they're inching closer to a missile capable of reaching the U.S. mainland.
This is an important step. There's still a window for trying to negotiate with North Korea, capping its nuclear and missile programs at a point where it's much less a threat to the United States.
Isn't it incredibly difficult to counter the 4,000 artillery pieces that the North Koreans have on the DMZ?
It is, sir, and THAAD is not designed to counter those kinds of basic weapons.
And what is designed to do that? Anything?
We do not have those kinds of weapons that can counter those rockets once they're launched.
It is the agenda for the 21st century you're living in today. For a brave new world where everything that you cherished and held true will no longer exist.
The story that came out tonight, as reported, is false. The president and the foreign minister reviewed a range of common threats to our two countries, including threats to civil aviation. At no time were intelligence sources or methods discussed. And the president did not disclose any military operations that were not already publicly known. Two other senior officials who were present, including the Secretary of State, remember the meeting the same way and have said so. Their on-the-record accounts should outweigh those of anonymous sources. And I was in the room. It didn't happen.
Former FBI Director James Comey boarding the organization's jet for the final time. President Trump unexpectedly fired the 56-year-old on Tuesday night. It followed recommendations from both the Attorney General and his deputy, citing handling of an investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server while Secretary of State.
Our judgment is that no reasonable prosecutor would bring such a case.
In Trump's letter of termination, he writes, "While I greatly appreciate you informing me on 3 separate occasions that I am not under investigation, I nevertheless concur with the judgment of the Department of Justice that you are not able to effectively lead the Bureau." The White House said that the new Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who was confirmed just 2 weeks ago, had lost confidence in Comey and determined that he should be replaced.
After President Donald Trump fired FBI Director James Comey, TV pundits hammered his spokespersons, Vice President Mike Pence and Counselor Kellyanne Conway, asserting that they misled the public.
They lied about why they fired the FBI director.
Here is Sarah Huckabee Sanders in an attempt to clarify again.
The White House had to change their story, which they did.
These and other critics are questioning the veracity of 3 aspects of Mr. Trump's firing of Mr. Comey. 1, the White House's original contention that it was acting on the recommendation of Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General. 2, Mr. Trump's contention that Comey told him on 3 occasions that the president himself was not the subject of an investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. And 3, Mr. Trump's assertion that he fired Comey because the FBI director had lost the confidence of the agency's rank and file. Why are they saying the White House was disingenuous? Let's start with Rosenstein.
Can you tell us why you made this recommendation to the president?
Sarah Sanders, the White House spokeswoman, suggested on Fox News on Tuesday that Trump reached his decision to fire Comey after receiving a
clear and direct and very strong recommendation by the Deputy Attorney General.
Asked if Mr. Trump had directed Rosenstein to write a recommendation that Comey be fired, she said no. As reported by the Wall Street Journal, Rosenstein wrote that memo on Tuesday at the White House's prompting. In that memo, Rosenstein never expressly recommended that Comey be fired. The Journal reports that Rosenstein is pressing the White House counsel to correct the record, objecting to the use of his critical assessment of Comey being used to justify Mr. Trump's decision to fire him. In an interview with NBC News on Thursday, Mr. Trump offered a new explanation.
Oh, I was going to fire regardless of recommendation. When I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election that they should have won.
Sanders questioned Thursday as to why she and others gave
answers that just weren't correct.
Said there was no intent to mislead.
I went off of the information that I had when I answered your question. I've since had the conversation with him right before I walked on today.
On the question of whether Comey told the president he was not the subject of the FBI's Russia's collusion investigation, Trump held firm on Thursday.
So he said it once at dinner. And then he said it twice during phone call.
Whether Comey said this to the president isn't at this point verifiable. Comey didn't address the matter in a farewell letter to his FBI colleagues or comment publicly about it. And acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe, appearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee on Thursday, declined to comment.
Sir, I can't comment on any conversations the director may have had with the president.
On the third point, that Mr. Trump fired Comey because
The rank and file of the FBI had lost confidence in their director.
the acting FBI Director on Thursday was asked for his take.
Is it accurate that the rank and file no longer supported Director Comey?
No, sir, that is not accurate.
Comey himself says he agrees with the president on this point, that Mr. Trump has every right to fire the FBI director for any reason or for no reason at all.
Senator Corker has just come out and spoken, obviously chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he has said they are in a downward spiral right now and have got to figure out a way to come to grips with all that's happening. That's a pretty strong statement and a stunning statement.
As climate change pushes sea levels higher and higher, many U.S. cities are facing a peculiar predicament: climate gentrification. Take Miami, for instance. Many neighborhoods in the city once denied financial services by lenders are now quickly gaining value. That's because they sit on high ground and are much less likely to flood than coastal properties. In Charleston, South Carolina, water levels could rise 7 inches by 2030. Officials say the city doesn't have the resources to protect existing public housing from sea level rise. And in Galveston, Texas, where 569 public housing buildings were destroyed by 2 hurricanes, the city initially stalled for 7 years on spending billions to rebuild them. Some saw it as an effort to keep public housing from coming back. By the year 2100, as many as 13 million Americans could be displaced by rising water levels, but many Americans are already seeing the effects now.
Welcome back. Right now, we are monitoring what fire crews are calling one of the worst wildfires in Sarasota County history.
That wildfire growing to 3,500 acres.
Take a look at some of this video from over the weekend. Right now, 3,500 acres are burning from this fire, and this fire is about 35% contained. Crews here tell us it's one of the fastest moving fires they've ever fought, growing 200 acres in just a half hour. Every piece of equipment in the Mayaca Forestry District was out Saturday, which is why they have the crews from South Carolina now, because they're just frankly so exhausted from fighting this fire.
Firefighters continue to battle a blaze that has scorched over 144,000 acres near the Georgia-Florida border. More than 700 first responders and 16 aircraft have been called into action to protect homes and property. So far, the fire is only 12% contained, as winds and dry conditions make it hard to put out the flames. The community of St. George in a direct path of the blaze.
We do have a ton of resources in between the fire and St. George, and we have contingency lines in place. We're reinforcing those contingency lines along with multiple air resources.
This blaze right here is on the Sarasota-Charlotte County line, and it now consumes more than 3,200 acres.
Right now, only 30% of this fire is contained.
8 people have died and more than 20 were injured after an earthquake hit China's Xinjiang region. The magnitude 5.5 quake shook a town near the border with Tajikistan. It was followed by a magnitude 5 aftershock. More than 180 houses collapsed. Rescue workers are checking the buildings for survivors. The region has been frequently hit by earthquakes in the past 6 years.
Glacier National Park is rapidly losing its namesakes. In the past 50 years, glaciers in the park have shrunk by 39% on average, though some have lost as much as 85% of their mass. And the U.S. Geological Survey says only 26 of the park's original 150 glaciers are large enough to actually be called glaciers. The massive melt-off isn't too surprising. Global warming is melting glaciers the world over. The Environmental Protection Agency says glaciers worldwide have been losing mass since at least the 1970s, but evidence suggests the melting could have started around the 1940s. And NASA says that worldwide glaciers shed nearly 400 billion tons of ice a year, and have been doing so since at least 1994. But Montana is in danger of losing its glaciers faster than the rest of the world. Western Montana, where Glacier National Park is located, is warming almost twice as fast as the global average. The glaciers in the park are thousands of years old, but if current trends continue, it could lose all of its active glaciers by 2030.
In 100 days, a highly anticipated solar eclipse will fill the American skies from Oregon to South Carolina. The last time a total eclipse appeared across this many states was nearly a century ago. Astronomers and researchers are now preparing for a rare chance to collect data on the sun's outer atmosphere.
This summer, on August 21st, millions of Americans will get a chance to see one of nature's most mysterious wonders, a total eclipse of the sun. Michael Zeiler, an expert in geographic information systems, describes the Great American Eclipse as a scene of unimaginable beauty. The last time a total eclipse swept the continental United States was in 1918, nearly a century ago. Researchers say they plan to take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime event.
Solar physicists know that the temperature of the sun's surface is roughly 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But the corona is about 1 to 2 million degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's a big difference. It's counterintuitive that the temperature would increase as you go away from the sun. So there's a big mystery about that.
Zeiler advises skywatchers to enjoy the moment and pay close attention because the eclipse will only be visible for about 2 minutes and 40 seconds before disappearing.
The eclipse travels across the nation from Oregon to South Carolina in 93 minutes. Those 93 minutes gives astronomers the opportunity to take a very detailed look at the sun's corona as it changes and evolves.
During that time, the moon will completely cover the sun so observers can safely look at it directly with the naked eye.
Climate change is threatening birds' migration patterns, according to a new study. Each spring, birds migrate from their winter hangouts to their breeding grounds. Birds know to begin migrating when the sun appears longer during the day, which happens the same way each time Earth goes through its orbit. So, if the birds arrive at the right time, breeding grounds will be full of food, from blooming plants to swarming insects. But the changing climate isn't as reliable as Earth's orbit, and it's throwing off when spring arrives each year. This could threaten whole bird species. If spring is late, the birds show up when there's less food and worse weather. And if spring starts early, the birds show up after resources have already been picked over. Either way, it'll be harder to survive, and they'll be able to hatch fewer chicks. Researchers studied 48 bird species and found that while most of them have adjusted their schedules to match the new seasons, 9 species of songbird have not. The researchers noted that this could be the first signs of a domino effect, because as climate is altered, nature may not be able to keep up.
Attention in the water. Attention in the water. This is the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Be advised, State Parks is asking us to make an announcement to let you know you are paddleboarding next to approximately 15 great white sharks. They're advising that you exit the water in a calm manner. The sharks are as close as the surf line. Thank you for your cooperation. Please be advised that this area is heavily populated at the moment with large great white sharks, some of which are in the surf line. Please do not enter the water.
Ini adalah paus jenis bumbuk dengan panjang 28 meter dan lebar 4 meter. Ini tampil. Ikan ini sudah menemui busuk. Mungkin bukan mati.
What is that?
"3,000 miles from the mainland, a remote paradise that's become a rubbish dump. Its beaches are now more densely polluted with plastic than anywhere else on Earth. Henderson Island is home only to South Pacific seabirds and marine wildlife, and with no human inhabitants, this should be a pristine haven. But an international team of researchers who visited and studied the island calculated that 17 tons of our litter, washed or dumped into rivers and oceans, have floated here over decades. Dr. Alex Bond saw the devastation up close.
We looked across the beaches in a variety of different plots and counted the pieces of plastic on the surface, and down to about 10 centimeters. And from that, we were able to extrapolate the area of the beaches. And that's how we came up with our estimate of about 38 million pieces on the island. And it's really shocking because as you step along the beach, I mean, the plastic is absolutely everywhere. No place is without it.
Most of the plastic waste they could identify appeared to come from China, Japan, and Chile. Most plastic floats, and it can take centuries to degrade. So when it reaches the ocean, it stays at the surface and is carried on the currents. Henderson Island sits just next to a vast circular system of ocean currents called the South Pacific Gyre, and that's depositing plastic from thousands of miles away onto its beaches.
At least 115 people have been killed by an outbreak of cholera in the Yemeni capital Sana'a, according to a local news agency. It comes after health authorities in the country declared a state of emergency on Sunday and called for international help to avoid an unprecedented disaster. These pictures were filmed at the weekend in Yemen's second largest hospital. The UN has said only a few medical facilities are still functioning and 2/3 of the population are without access to safe drinking water.
The opioid epidemic, a serious issue around the country. The CDC says each day 91 people die from overdoses. 91.
On any given day, the Warwick, Rhode Island Fire Department's Rescue 1 rolls on a dozen calls. Traffic accidents are routine, and so are overdoses on opioids like heroin, fentanyl, and oxycodone.
And we spray this up into the nostril.
Rescue Lieutenant Henrik Dunleavy shows one of the methods for administering Narcan, a life-saving drug for opioid OD. He's seen a dramatic uptick in addict rescue calls in his 17 years on the job, and sometimes saves the same people over and over again.
The worst drug-induced epidemic in U.S. history.
Bertha Madras is a neuroscientist on President Trump's opioid task force. She says the crisis traces its origins to a pair of studies in the 1980s, including this one in the New England Journal of Medicine, which declared addiction was rare for patients treated with narcotics. Pharmaceutical companies launched aggressive campaigns promoting powerful meds like Vicodin and OxyContin. There was movement to name pain as the fifth vital sign, and physicians began writing hundreds of millions of prescriptions based on what Madras calls poor science.
Nobody had done long-term studies on treating chronic pain with opioids. There was nothing in the literature.
You can't overstate the pressures that were put on young physicians in the late 80s and early 90s to treat pain, not just adequately, but aggressively treat pain.
Dr. Michael Dacey is the president and COO of Rhode Island's Kent Hospital. 3 ODs arrived by ambulance in the hour or so we were there, 2 more the next day. Dr. Dacey says the medical community was misled, but it shares responsibility for this deadly scourge.
You had a combination of people fervently trying to do the right thing at the same time as these more potent, newer forms of narcotics like OxyContin came along that were marketed initially as being not as addictive. Turns out they were at least as addictive. So you had this perfect storm coming together, and as physicians, we own a piece of this.
In upstate New York, the opioid epidemic forced Syracuse Behavioral Health Care to dramatically expand its facility.
We serve a couple of hundred patients. Now we're serving over 900.
And that isn't enough. We're literally bursting at the seams.
The opiate treatment program distributes methadone and other drugs through dosing windows with nurses and counselors on duty around the clock. Because CEO Jeremy Klemanski says if addicts don't get immediate treatment, they will die.
We don't debate whether or not someone with chest pain would likely die if they didn't get into an emergency room. We don't debate whether a diabetic left untreated would really die of their diabetes and when. But for some reason in this sector of healthcare, sometimes there are people who want to debate those things. And the reality is the debate is over.
I mean, what word would you use to describe the opioid crisis in Ohio?
Overwhelming.
Overwhelming how?
Overwhelming in that it moves faster than we can keep up. It's like always trying to hit a moving target. Just when we think we've made some changes that are going to affect the outcome we think, something else happens.
We've got to recognize it before we can do anything about it. If we don't recognize it and we keep the blinders, then I guess we can't complain about our heroin problem, can we? Because it's here.
I knew in my heart that it wasn't right. The things I was doing wasn't right, and I wasn't at ease with it. You know, it wasn't something that I just said, "Oh well, this is who I am."
God knows I didn't want to be a junkie in an alley or sleeping on the railroad tracks. I never grew up that way. I was A/B honor roll student in school. You know, I came from a very good family.
This is one of a handful of housing developments in Kenya promoting solar-powered homes in the country. Green Park was founded in 2006, and the 150-acre estate has 400 units, all fitted with solar panels for water heating. Each solar unit costs about $800 to install.
Astronomers have discovered a cloudy, watery atmosphere on an exoplanet 437 light-years away. More than 3,000 exoplanets have been discovered to date, but it can be tough to learn about their atmospheres. They're orbiting stars that are light-years away, and sometimes they're so close to those stars that it's too bright to see details. And different exoplanets can gain atmospheres in different ways. Some gather hydrogen and helium while they form. Some get layers of complex organic molecules. And some, like this Neptune-sized planet we just found, show clear signs of water in their atmosphere, probably gathered sometime after it formed. Water vapor isn't especially rare on exoplanets. Gas giants can have a lot of it. In 2014, a team found some on an exoplanet 124 light-years away. The researchers say this new finding will help them understand how exoplanets get their variety of atmospheres and offer clues as to how they form.
A dispute over a birthday cake reportedly got a family from New Jersey kicked off a JetBlue flight.
Unfortunately, they're going to have to rebook everyone, and that's...
Rebook everyone?
And this is what we're trying to avoid that. We wish we
This is JetBlue?
It's JetBlue, so...
JetBlue, wow.
Well, the incident occurred at JFK Airport earlier this month. JetBlue says the customers refused to remove a cake from an overhead bin reserved for safety equipment. The captain decided to remove Cameron Burke, his wife, their children from the flight.
Stop it! What is wrong with you? Get off! Stop it! Excuse me, I'm watching. Get out of the way. Do something, That's it. Hey, move.
One more if anybody's got any. Yeah, brother.
Hillary Clinton announced Monday that she is getting back into the political arena. The 2016 Democratic nominee said she is launching a new initiative called Onward Together, a political nonprofit that will help fund some of the organizations at the forefront of the progressive movement.
When you think of the world, this is probably the map that comes to mind. It's everywhere. Atlases, school walls, even Google Maps. It's also very, very wrong, and it's been distorting our view of the world for centuries. This is a Mercator projection. It's one of the most common projections used for world maps. This guy, Gerardus Mercator, created it in 1569 to help with ship navigation. The map was revolutionary because it straightened both lines of latitude and longitude, which was great for sailing. All you had to do was draw a line to where you wanted to go on the map and follow your compass. But to make a navigation-friendly map, the projection distorts land masses the closer they are to the poles. That gives us the wrong idea about the relative size and maybe even the importance of some regions. This creates what some map makers call the Greenland problem. This is Greenland on Mercator's map. It's huge. Here, Greenland is bigger than the entire continent of South America. The same thing happens with Alaska. The state looks bigger than the entire country of Mexico. The farther land is from the equator on a Mercator map, the more stretched out it looks. In reality, South America is 8 times the size of Greenland, and Mexico is actually bigger than Alaska. For the same reason, this is what 2,000 miles looks like on a Mercator map, but so is this. It's the same distance, the fault is in the map. This happens because map makers have to rely on mathematical formulas to project the surface of the Earth, a sphere, onto the surface of a map, a plane. Calculus and complex algebra eventually improved map projections, yet the Mercator stubbornly remained a popular general world map. While it made for a great navigation map, it was also being used as a geographic map in classrooms and atlases. The distorted view of Earth's land masses in a Mercator's projection became how people saw the world. Mapmakers and geographers were not happy. Everything started to change in the mid-20th century. There was a world war, and more airplanes were being used than ever before. Editorials published in the New York Times in the 40s called for the Mercator to be discarded and reminded readers the grossness of its errors should not be forgotten. In a series of orthographic maps in 1942 and 43, Fortune magazine declared the Mercator is no map for global war, and it was a dangerous map to use in studying global strategy. An expose on cartography Life published around the same time called the Mercator a mental hazard in a war that is plotted on great circles across the land and sea and through the air. Perhaps nowhere was the rejection of Mercator's projection more apparent than with Richard Eads Harrison's illustrations. The architect turned illustrator for Fortune magazine created maps truly fit for a world dominated by flight, offering revolutionary views of the planet as World War II raged. With Harrison's maps, it was clear just how obvious the United States' isolation was, or how many neighbors Europe had. It was at this time that maps were starting to take on a new use: persuasion.
This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO.
Suddenly, maps became a convenient way to show just how threatening Germany's neighbor Czechoslovakia was, when it really wasn't, or how imperative it was to fight communism, or how threatening other countries were to the USSR. A transverse oblique homolographic map does wonders for showing how close and how threatening the USSR really was in this Times Atlas map. Eventually, a German historian created what he said was a revolutionary map projection that he marketed as the solution to the Mercator. For Arno Peters, the Mercator represented Western imperialism. His new projection, with a more prominent Africa and South America, was meant to emphasize what he called the Third World. Reactions ranged from cautious amusement to outright hostility. Peters had trashed the cartographic community in writings promoting his map, and his version really wasn't even that original. A Scottish clergyman named James Gall had created virtually the same thing in 1885. Eventually, the American Congress on Surveying and Mapping stepped in and had a resolution. The organization and 6 other cartographic groups urged map publishers, the media, and government agencies to stop using rectangular depictions like the Gall-Peters and Mercator for general purposes. The answer to the Greenland problem was not a new rectangular map, but instead non-rectangular projections like the Mole-Wide or the Eckhart 4. The media picked up the resolution. There was a column in the Washington Post, and it even made it to the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Right there. The Gall-Peters hasn't gone away. Boston Public Schools recently said it will now use the Gall-Peters in classrooms to quote-unquote decolonize the curriculum. But it's not like the Gall-Peters is replacing all maps. You can find different types of maps everywhere. The UN logo has an azimuthal projection, and a good homolocene is in the background of CBS's evening news broadcast. But if you're really concerned about how to look at the world, you should probably just buy a globe.
Yeah.